Some of this stuff to European markets. But to do this, they had to move all this stuff to Boston. Why? Because of federal law, the ships coming across on what they called the Atlantic Ferry Service from England, run by the Cunard Line, were only allowed to dock in Boston and no place else. That's because there was a lot of money in shipping back in those days, and Massachusetts wanted to keep this plum for themselves, being the Atlantic Ferry Service. So they ran several ships 3 times a week from Boston to England, and it only took a few days for each trip. Now, what they wanted to do was basically link New York with Boston, but they couldn't use the South Shore of Connecticut, where Metro North runs today, because it was decided that it was too expensive and beyond their technology to build a rail line in that area. Why? Well, if you ever took Metro North or drove up Route 95, you'll see it goes from a bridge to a cut to a fill to a bridge to a cut to a fill. Too much money and beyond their technology in the 1840s. In fact, the railroad line that Metro North uses today along the South Shore of Connecticut, that wasn't even completed until the 1890s, because it was a very complex piece of engineering. So what they decided to do was use Long Island itself as a land bridge between New York Harbor and Connecticut, because Long Island, because of its geology, which I'm going to get into a little bit later, is nice and flat and only made out of sand and loose gravel. So the way this railroad line was set up was that the railroad lines heading west and south ended at Jersey City on the other side of New York Harbor. Then the ferries, by way of Manhattan, brought everything to the foot of Atlantic Avenue, where Pier 7 is today. Then the passengers and freight got put onto waiting trains that then went 95 miles out that way towards the east to a place called Greenport in Suffolk County. At Greenport, there was a second intermodal ferry connection, which had 2 destinations. One ferry ran across the Sound to Stonington, Connecticut, where you hooked up with the New York, Providence, and Boston Railroad up to Boston through a southerly route. And then the other ferry went to a place called Allin's Point near Norwich, Connecticut, where you then took the Norwich and Worcester Railroad up to Boston through a westerly route. So the Long Island Railroad had 2 routes to Boston, a southerly route through Providence and a westerly route through Norwich. So the railroad line was a big success the minute it went into operation, because it was much better than the steamboats that used to run between New York and Boston that would take a day or a day and a half to do the run, and a lot of times boilers they had would catch on fire and incinerate the wooden steamship. So the railroad line was much safer to use to a certain extent, and it was much faster. The rail line between New York and Boston only took 8.5 to 10 hours, including all the ferry connections. Now, if you go between New York and Boston today and you drive up 95, it's still going to take 8.5 to 10 hours. You're going to sit in traffic on Long Connecticut. So the railroad became a victim of its own success, essentially instantaneously, because the railroad line was beyond the technology of the time period, and here's why. Trains didn't have brakes yet. Air brakes were not invented until after the Civil War. Now, at the time, in the 1840s, the Long Island Railroad was the fastest railroad in the United States. They had trains running 50 and 60 miles an hour, and that's how they were able to keep that schedule between New York and Boston. Now, the trains could go pretty fast, but they didn't have adequate brakes. Now, 2 blocks east of here, 2 blocks beyond where you came in through that manhole, that's where the woods were originally. So what happened was the trains would come out of the woods going 40 miles an hour, then they'd come onto the street, which was developed along this stretch from Borum Place up to the waterfront. That was the developed depth of downtown Brooklyn from the waterfront, half a mile inland. And the trains would come out into the street from the woods, going 40 and 50 miles an hour, and run people over. Now, the railroad line didn't so much care about the trains running people over or smashing up horses and wagons, because it was very difficult to sue railroads back then. What the railroad did get upset about was that it made them, by cleaning up the mess and putting the train back on the tracks, it made them miss their ferry connection at the foot of Atlantic Avenue. So that they were very upset about. Now, simultaneous with this happening, the people who lived along Atlantic Avenue got together a petition to the city demanding that the Long Island Railroad be forced to take all their tracks off the surface of the street and put them underground into a tunnel. So thus was born the first subway. This was the first time this was ever done, where they took a railroad line off the surface of a street and put it into an underground tunnel under the street for the sole purpose of getting the tracks off the surface. And this is called grade separation. Grade separation is the whole concept that goes to the heart of what a subway line or a rapid transit line is. Now there's several ways you can get grade separation. One way is by digging a tunnel. That's the most effective way. Another way is to have an open trench and you run your trains in the trench. And another way is to put your tracks on top of an earth embankment. An example of those two methods would be the Q train where it cuts across Brooklyn towards Coney Island. Then you'd have another method, which is where you build a viaduct above the street, and an example of that would be, say, the F train on McDonald Avenue on the elevated structure. But the best way of getting grade separation is by digging a tunnel. Now, once they decided to build a tunnel, they had to go and check out the geology of what's underneath, because usually tunnels were built by methods involving mining techniques, like drilling through rock or breaking through hard clay. Now, when they did their tests along Atlantic Avenue, they found out there's nothing here underneath except loose sand and gravel, and you can't build a regular tunnel through this. So what they had to do was go back to a Roman tunneling method that was developed 2,000 years ago called cut and cover. The Romans came up with this method to install aqueducts in their cities and also to build highway overpasses on their extensive road system, and also for underground vaults. The actual Roman terminology for this type of a structure was called a cryptoportico, which means hidden place. Now what we're going to do is I want everyone to hold still, and let me get down to the front of the line, and then we're going to start walking, and the story will continue at the next air shaft. Just hold still for a minute while I waddle down the steps. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. All right. Now, Right now, this is one of the architectural features of the interior of the tunnel. This is one of the old shafts that they used to use for evacuating the steam from the train, from the steam locomotives. And they also would let light come down here for these shafts during daylight hours. Now, back in the day, they didn't have artificial lighting for tunnels, at least not in Brooklyn. So during the daylight hours, the light would come down the shaft, and then they painted the roof of the tunnel white, so the light would then reflect down the length of the tunnel. Now, the black stuff on top of the white stuff is actually balled up fragments of soot from the steam engines that ran through here from 1844 to 1861. Now, the tunnel was half a mile long, and obviously it had entrances at both ends. The entrance at the waterfront end, where the main railroad terminal was at Columbia Street, was in the middle of Atlantic Avenue, halfway between Hicks and Columbia. And then the other entrance to the tunnel was about 150 feet beyond the ladder you came in on in the middle of the road.